They say family is everything, but what happens when your family makes you feel like nothing? My name is Jessica, and I'm about to tell you a story that changed my life forever. It started on Christmas Eve, in a house where I never truly belonged, with words that cut deeper than any blade. But sometimes, the most painful moments become the catalyst for the most beautiful transformations. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. I still remember the smell of cinnamon and pine that filled Aunt Margaret's house every Christmas Eve. For 23 years, I'd walked through that front door hoping this would be the year I'd finally feel like I belonged. But hope, I learned, can be a dangerous thing when it's built on quicksand. My parents died in a car accident when I was 5, and Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert took me in. They had 3 children of their own, my cousins Sarah, Michael, and little Emma. And from day one, I was reminded that I was the extra piece in their perfectly assembled puzzle. Not through grand gestures of cruelty, but through 1,000 tiny cuts that bled slowly over the years. "Jessica, can you help in the kitchen?" Aunt Margaret called from the dining room where she was arranging the Christmas centerpiece. "The family will be arriving soon." The family. Never our family or everyone. Always the family, as if I were the hired help, rather than someone who'd lived under this roof for over 2 decades. I tied my apron around my waist and began pulling dishes from the oven, the same routine I'd performed every holiday since I was old enough to reach the countertops. Sarah breezed into the kitchen, her designer dress immaculate, despite having 3 young children in tow. "Mom, where should I put the kids' gifts? The living room is already so crowded with everyone else's presents." "Just put them under the tree, dear," Aunt Margaret replied, not looking up from her arranging. "Jessica, make sure you move your little gift aside. We need room for the real family presents." My little gift. A carefully chosen book for each family member, wrapped in paper I'd saved from my teacher's salary for months. The Real Family Presents. The words hit me like a slap, but I swallowed the hurt and smiled. I'd become an expert at swallowing hurt. Uncle Robert entered the kitchen, already reaching for his 3rd beer of the evening. "Jessica, after dinner you'll need to park down the street. We're expecting the Hendersons to stop by, and we need the driveway clear for our guests." "Of course," I replied, my voice steady despite the familiar ache in my chest. Even on Christmas Eve, I was an inconvenience to be managed. The house gradually filled with extended family, neighbors, and friends. The same faces that had watched me grow up. The same people who'd witnessed my graduations, my teaching awards, my small victories and defeats. Yet somehow, I remained invisible among them, a shadow moving through the edges of their conversations. Dinner was a symphony of laughter and stories I wasn't part of. I sat at the card table that had been my designated spot since childhood, while the real family occupied the main dining table. The conversation flowed around me like a river around a stone, occasionally acknowledging my presence, but never truly including me. "Jessica's still teaching those inner-city kids," Uncle Robert announced to the table, his voice carrying that tone people use when they're trying to find something nice to say about someone they don't particularly like. Such a noble profession. Noble. The word dripped with condescension, as if my choice to teach was some sort of charity work, rather than a career I'd chosen because I genuinely loved helping children learn and grow. "Well, we can't all marry well," Aunt Margaret added with a pointed look at Sarah, who was regaling everyone with stories of her husband's latest business success. "Some of us have to make do with what we can manage." The comment was meant to sting, and it did. At 28, I was apparently a disappointment for not having snagged a wealthy husband. Never mind that I had a master's degree, that I'd been Teacher of the Year 2 years running, that I'd bought my own small apartment and car without anyone's help. None of that mattered in Aunt Margaret's world. As the evening wore on, I helped clear dishes and serve dessert, playing my role as the family servant with practiced efficiency. The children ran around the house, high on sugar and excitement, while the adults settled into the living room with coffee and brandy. "Jessica," Aunt Margaret called from her place on the sofa, "be a dear and start on those dishes. The dishwasher's been acting up again." I nodded and retreated to the kitchen, grateful for the solitude. Through the window above the sink, I could see the twinkling lights on the houses across the street. Real families, I imagined, with children who belonged and parents who loved unconditionally. I'd spent so many nights at this window, dreaming of what it would feel like to truly belong somewhere. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, punctuated by Aunt Margaret's voice rising above the others. "You know, I was telling Robert just yesterday how different Jessica is from the rest of us. It's like she's from another planet sometimes. I froze, my hands still immersed in soapy water. The conversation was clearly audible through the thin walls. "What do you mean?" I heard Sarah ask. "Oh, you know," Aunt Margaret continued, her voice warming to the topic. "She's always been so serious, so different. Even as a child, she never quite fit in. I suppose some people are just born to be outsiders." My heart hammered against my ribs. I should have walked away, should have turned on the radio or hummed a song to drown out their voices. But I was frozen, a mouse caught in the light, unable to move as the conversation continued. "I think she tries too hard," Michael chimed in. "Always bringing those books for gifts, always wanting to talk about her students. It's like she doesn't understand that we're not really interested." "She means well," Uncle Robert said, but his tone suggested this was more of a burden than a blessing. "But Margaret's right. She's never been quite family, you know? Not really. Not really family." The words echoed in my head like a death knell. 23 years of trying, of hoping, of believing that somehow I could earn my place among them. 23 years of Christmas mornings where I watched them exchange meaningful gifts while I received practical items. Socks, generic gift cards, things that said obligation rather than love. "I feel bad for her sometimes," Sarah said, and I could hear the pity in her voice. "She's so alone. But then I think, maybe that's just who she is. Some people are meant to be alone." The glass I'd been washing slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the bottom of the sink. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen, and I knew they'd heard it in the living room. "Jessica?" Aunt Margaret called. "Everything all right in there?" "Fine," I managed to call back, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "Just dropped something." I stood there staring at the broken pieces, seeing my life reflected in their jagged edges. All these years, I'd been trying to fit into a family that had never wanted me to fit. I'd been trying to earn love from people who saw me as an obligation, a burden, a reminder of tragedy they'd rather forget. The laughter resumed in the living room, but it sounded different now, hollow, cruel. Or maybe I was just hearing it clearly for the first time. I finished the dishes in silence, my mind reeling. When I finally emerged from the kitchen, the family was gathered around the tree, opening presents. The same ritual I'd participated in every year, receiving my token gifts while watching them shower each other with thoughtful, expensive items that spoke of genuine care and attention. Jessica, Emma, now 16, and the only one who'd ever shown me consistent kindness, bounded over with a small wrapped box. "I got you something special this year." I unwrapped it to find a beautiful silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a book. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. Emma had always been different from the others, more sensitive, more aware of the dynamics that the adults either ignored or perpetuated. "I wanted to get you something that was really you," she said, hugging me tightly, "because you're a teacher, and teachers are special." For a moment, the warmth of her embrace pushed back the cold that had settled in my chest. But then I caught Aunt Margaret's expression over Emma's shoulder, a look of annoyance, as if even this small gesture of kindness toward me was somehow inappropriate. "Emma, come open your presents from Santa," Aunt Margaret said, her voice sharp with disapproval. Emma gave me one last squeeze before reluctantly joining the others. I sat on the periphery, watching the family exchange gifts and jokes, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The conversation from the kitchen played on repeat in my mind. Not really family. Never quite fit in. Born to be outsiders. Some people are meant to be alone. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I helped with the cleanup, same as always, but something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The hope that had sustained me for 23 years was dying, and in its place, something harder was beginning to grow. "Jessica," Aunt Margaret said as I was wiping down the last of the counters, "I want to talk to you about something." I turned to face her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She looked older than her 58 years, her face pinched with the perpetual dissatisfaction that came from a life spent keeping score of other people's shortcomings. "I've been thinking," she continued, "and I believe it's time you started spending the holidays somewhere else. You're a grown woman now, and it's not healthy for you to keep clinging to the past like this. Clinging to the past, as if my presence here was some sort of pathological attachment, rather than a young woman's desperate need to belong somewhere. This is my home," I said quietly. "This has been my home for 23 years. This is our home," she corrected, emphasis on the our. "And you're welcome to visit, of course. But holidays are for family. Real family." There it was again. Real family. The phrase that had haunted me through the kitchen window, now delivered like a final verdict. "I think it would be best if you made other arrangements for next Christmas," Uncle Robert added from the doorway. "Nothing personal, you understand. But the house gets so crowded and, well, we think it's time." Time. Time for what? Time for me to disappear completely from their lives? Time for them to stop pretending they cared about the orphaned girl they'd taken in out of duty rather than love? I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours preparing their meals, cleaning their dishes, trying to earn my place through service. I looked at the living room where I'd sat on the edges of their conversations for over 2 decades. I looked at the staircase that led to my childhood bedroom, the only space in this house that had ever truly felt like mine. "I understand," I said, and somehow, miraculously, my voice remained steady. "I'll make other arrangements." Aunt Margaret looked relieved, as if she'd been dreading this conversation, but was glad to have it behind her. "I'm glad you're being so reasonable about this. I was worried you might make a scene." Make a scene. As if I'd ever made a scene about anything in my entire life. As if I hadn't spent 23 years being the most accommodating, undemanding person in their orbit. When do you want me to move out?" I asked. "Oh, there's no rush," Uncle Robert said, waving his hand dismissively. "Take your time. A few months, maybe. Just, start looking for somewhere else to call home." Somewhere else to call home. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been looking for a home my entire life, and I'd been foolish enough to think I'd found it here. I gathered my things, my purse, my coat, Emma's necklace, and headed for the door. "I'll be back for my belongings soon," I said. "Jessica," Aunt Margaret called after me, "you know we care about you. This isn't about not caring. It's just time." I turned back one last time, looking at the woman who'd raised me, who'd fed me and clothed me and sent me to school, but who'd never once looked at me with the same love she had for her own children. "I know," I said. "It's just time." And then I walked out into the cold Christmas Eve night, leaving behind the only family I'd ever known, carrying nothing but the weight of their rejection and a silver necklace that reminded me of who I really was. The night air was sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of confusion and hurt that had surrounded me for hours. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to make myself small and grateful for scraps of affection. The Christmas lights that had seemed so magical an hour ago now looked garish and fake. I thought about Emma's necklace, about the kindness in her eyes when she'd given it to me. "A teacher," she'd said. "Teachers are special." For the first time in hours, I felt something other than pain. I felt a spark of recognition, of self-worth that had nothing to do with whether or not I belonged in this house. I was a teacher. I was good at my job. I made a difference in children's lives every single day. I had my own apartment, my own car, my own life that I'd built despite having no real family support. I was not the pathetic, clinging creature Aunt Margaret had made me out to be. I started the car and drove home to my small apartment, where my cat Buster was waiting for me with his usual indifferent affection. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my own window, looking out at my own view of the city lights. For the first time in my life, I was spending Christmas Eve entirely alone, and somehow, impossibly, I felt less lonely than I had in years. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts and emotions. The hurt was still there, raw and immediate, but underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. I'd spent 23 years trying to be worthy of their love, and it had never worked because the problem wasn't me. The problem was that they'd never intended to love me. I'd been a duty, an obligation, a constant reminder of a tragedy they'd rather forget. But I was also a survivor. I'd lost my parents, been raised by people who saw me as a burden, and still managed to build a life. I'd graduated from college, earned my master's degree, become a teacher who genuinely cared about her students. I'd done all of that despite having no one in my corner, no one cheering me on, no one who believed in me. Maybe it was time I started believing in myself. Christmas morning dawned gray and quiet. I'd always spent Christmas morning at Aunt Margaret's house, helping prepare the big breakfast, watching the children open their Santa gifts, pretending to be grateful for whatever practical item they'd wrapped up for me. This year, I made pancakes for one, and watched old movies with Buster purring on my lap. It wasn't the Christmas I'd imagined, but it wasn't the worst Christmas I'd ever had either. There was something to be said for honesty, for not having to pretend to be grateful for scraps of affection from people who saw you as an inconvenience. Over the next few days, I began to think seriously about my future. I'd been living in the same small apartment for 5 years, saving money, but never really investing in anything permanent, because part of me was always waiting for Aunt Margaret's family to finally accept me fully. Now I realized that acceptance was never coming, and I was free to build something real for myself. I started looking at houses. Not apartments, houses. Places where I could put down roots, where I could paint the walls whatever color I wanted, where I could have a garden, and maybe get a dog to keep Buster company. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I also started thinking about what I wanted to say to them when I went back for my belongings. All my life, I'd been the accommodating one, the grateful one, the one who never made waves. But maybe it was time to make some waves. The week between Christmas and New Year's was always quiet at school, but I went in anyway to work on lesson plans and grade papers. The familiar routine was comforting, and being surrounded by my students' artwork and projects reminded me of who I was outside of the dysfunction of Aunt Margaret's house. Ms. Rodriguez! I looked up to see Aiden, one of my third graders, running toward me with his mother close behind. "What are you doing here? It's Christmas break." "Just catching up on some work," I said, kneeling down to his level. "How was your Christmas?" "It was awesome. I got a new bike and some books, and my mom made cookies shaped like dinosaurs." His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling for the first time in days. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I can't wait to hear all about it when we get back to school." Ms. Rodriguez, Aiden's mother Maria, approached us. "I'm so glad we ran into you. I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for Aiden this year. He's never been so excited about school before." "It's my pleasure," I said. "He's a bright kid with a lot of curiosity. That's a gift." "You're the gift," Maria said firmly. "Some teachers just go through the motions, but you really care about these kids. You make a difference." After they left, I sat alone in my classroom, surrounded by the evidence of my life's work, drawings from students, thank you notes from parents, certificates and awards I'd earned. This was who I was. This was what mattered. Not whether Aunt Margaret thought I belonged at her dinner table. Not whether Uncle Robert thought my profession was noble in that condescending way. Not whether my cousins found my conversation topics interesting. I was a teacher. I was good at my job. I made a difference in children's lives. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That evening I called a realtor. "I'm looking for a house," I told her. "Something small but with good bones. Something I can make my own." "What's your budget?" she asked. I told her, and she was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a pretty good budget for a first-time buyer. Have you been saving for a while?" "My whole life," I said, and realized it was true. While other people my age were spending money on vacations and designer clothes and expensive dinners out, I'd been saving every penny I could, always with some vague notion that someday I'd need it for something important. Someday had arrived. Over the next few weeks, I looked at dozens of houses with my realtor Karen. Some were too big, some too small, some too expensive, some too run down. But I was in no hurry. For the first time in my life, I was making a decision based entirely on what I wanted, not on what other people expected of me. And then Karen showed me a house that made my heart stop. It was a small craftsman bungalow on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. The front porch had built-in benches and columns that spoke of attention to detail. The yard was small, but well-maintained, with flower beds that would be gorgeous in the spring and summer. "It needs some work," Karen warned me as we walked through the front door. "The kitchen hasn't been updated since the 1980s, and the bathroom could use a refresh, but the bones are solid, and the price reflects the need for updates." I barely heard her. I was too busy falling in love with the hardwood floors, the built-in bookshelves, the way the afternoon light streamed through the living room windows. The kitchen was indeed dated, but it was spacious and had good bones. The bathroom was small but functional. The 2 bedrooms were perfect. One for me, one for a home office where I could work on lesson plans and grade papers. "I'll take it," I said. Karen blinked. "Don't you want to think about it? Maybe see a few more places?" "I've been thinking about it my whole life," I said. "This is it. This is home." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of mortgage applications, inspections, and paperwork. I'd never bought a house before, but I was amazed at how straightforward the process was when you had good credit and a solid down payment. All those years of living below my means, of saving instead of spending, had prepared me for this moment. 3 days before closing, I drove past the house again, just to make sure I wasn't dreaming. It was real. It was mine. In 72 hours, I would have the keys to my own home. As I sat in my car looking at my future, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The house directly across the street looked familiar. Very familiar. I pulled out my phone and looked up the address. Then I looked up Aunt Margaret's address. Then I looked at the map, tracing the route between the two houses. My new house was exactly one street over from Aunt Margaret's. If I walked through the backyards, I could probably see her kitchen window from my back porch. I'd bought a house right next door to the family that had just kicked me out of their lives. For a moment, I wondered if I should back out of the deal. Was this some sort of subconscious self-sabotage? Was I setting myself up for more pain by living so close to people who'd made it clear they didn't want me around? But then I looked at my house again, my house, and felt that same sense of rightness I'd experienced the first time I'd walked through the door. This house had nothing to do with Aunt Margaret or Uncle Robert or anyone else. This house was about me, about my future, about building something that was entirely my own. If they didn't like having me as a neighbor, well, that was their problem to solve. I closed on the house on a Friday afternoon in late January. Karen handed me the keys with a huge smile. "Congratulations, Jessica. You're officially a homeowner." I stood alone in my empty living room, keys in hand, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in something I'd accomplished entirely on my own. This house was mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could kick me out. No one could make me feel like I didn't belong here. I belonged here because I'd chosen to be here. I belonged here because I'd worked for it, saved for it, earned it. I belonged here because it was mine. That weekend, I moved my belongings from my apartment to my new house. It didn't take long. I'd never been one to accumulate a lot of stuff, but each box I carried across the threshold felt like a small victory, a small act of defiance against everyone who'd ever made me feel like I didn't deserve to take up space in the world. Buster seemed to approve of the new digs, immediately claiming the sunny spot by the living room window as his own. I set up my bedroom first, then my home office, then spent the rest of the weekend just wandering around, touching the walls, sitting in different rooms, getting used to the idea that this was all mine. On Sunday evening, I was unpacking books in my living room when I heard voices from the backyard. I peeked through the blinds and saw Aunt Margaret hanging laundry on the line behind her house. She was talking to her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, about something, their voices carrying clearly across the small space between our properties. "I don't know who bought the Morrison place," Aunt Margaret was saying. "The realtor said it was a young woman, but I haven't seen her yet." "Well, I hope she's quieter than the Morrisons were," Mrs. Henderson replied. "All those parties and that music. I'm getting too old for that nonsense." I smiled to myself. They had no idea their new neighbor was me. The irony was almost too perfect. I spent the next few weeks settling into my new routine. I loved everything about homeownership, from the small repairs I could tackle myself to the larger projects I was planning for the spring. I researched kitchen renovations, planted winter vegetables in my back garden, and began to understand what people meant when they talked about nesting instincts. The house was starting to feel like home, in a way that Aunt Margaret's house never had. Every decision I made, from the color of the bathroom towels to the arrangement of furniture, was mine alone. There was no one to judge my choices, no one to make me feel like my preferences were wrong or inappropriate. I was living my life on my own terms for the first time ever, and it was intoxicating. One evening in mid-February, I was working in my garden when I heard my name being called. I looked up to see Emma standing at the back fence, her eyes wide with surprise. "Jessica, what are you doing here?" I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. "I live here now. I bought this house last month." Emma's mouth fell open. "You bought the house behind ours?" "Right next door," I confirmed. "Small world, isn't it?" She looked around my yard, taking in the neat rows of vegetables I'd planted, the bird feeders I'd hung from the oak tree, the small patio set I'd arranged near the back door. "It looks amazing. You've done so much work already. Thank you. I love it here." Emma was quiet for a moment, then looked back toward her house. "Does Mom know?" "Not yet. I haven't exactly announced my presence. She's going to flip out," Emma said, but she was smiling. "This is amazing. You're like, right here. I can come visit you anytime." "You're always welcome," I said. "But Emma, things are different now. You understand that, right?" Her smile faded slightly. "I know what happened at Christmas. I know what Mom said. I don't agree with her." "You don't need to apologize for your mother," I said gently. "And you don't need to choose sides. I just want you to know that I'm okay. I'm happy here." Emma nodded, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was caught between her loyalty to her family and her affection for me, and I hated that she was in that position. I should go, she said. But Jessica, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're okay. After she left, I sat on my back porch thinking about the conversation. It had been good to see Emma, but it had also stirred up emotions I'd been trying to keep buried. I was happy in my new house, genuinely happy. But seeing Emma reminded me of everything I'd lost when I'd been banished from the family. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard raised voices from the backyard. I peeked through my kitchen window and saw Aunt Margaret and Emma having what appeared to be an intense discussion near the back fence. "Cannot believe you didn't tell me immediately," Aunt Margaret was saying. "How long have you known?" "Just since yesterday," Emma replied. "And I don't see what the big deal is. She bought a house. Good for her. The big deal is that she's practically stalking us, buying a house right next door after we specifically asked her to move on with her life. It's inappropriate and creepy." Stalking, creepy, inappropriate. The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd been expecting some version of this reaction. "She's not stalking anyone," Emma said firmly. "She bought a house she liked in a neighborhood she could afford. It's not like she moved here to spy on us. Don't be naive, Emma. This is exactly the kind of thing Jessica would do. She's always been too attached, too needy. We gave her every opportunity to build her own life, and instead, she follows us here." I turned away from the window, my hands shaking with anger. Too attached, too needy, as if my presence in their lives had been some sort of burden they'd nobly shouldered, rather than a relationship they'd chosen to nurture. Well, I was done being grateful for scraps. I was done being the accommodating one. I was done letting them define who I was and what I deserved. I marched out my back door and across my yard to the fence. "Good morning, Aunt Margaret." Both women turned to stare at me. Aunt Margaret's face went through several different expressions before settling on a pinched look of displeasure. "Jessica, Emma told me you'd bought a house in the neighborhood." "I did. Last month. I'm very happy here. It's a lovely house," Emma said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. "Jessica's fixed up the garden and everything." "Yes, well," Aunt Margaret said, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's quite a coincidence, isn't it? You ending up right next door to us." "Not really," I said calmly. "I looked at dozens of houses before I found this one. I bought it because I liked it, and I could afford it. The fact that you live nearby is irrelevant." Aunt Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Irrelevant?" "Completely. My life doesn't revolve around your family anymore, Aunt Margaret. I'm building my own life now, and it's turning out to be quite wonderful." "I think it's great," Emma said, earning a sharp look from her mother. "Jessica deserves to be happy." "Of course she deserves to be happy," Aunt Margaret said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I just think it's a bit much having you right here. Then perhaps you should consider moving," I said sweetly. "I'm quite settled here." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Aunt Margaret's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought she might actually shout at me, but then she seemed to remember that we were in public, with neighbors potentially watching. "Well," she said stiffly, "I suppose we'll all have to adjust." "I suppose we will," I agreed. "Have a lovely day, Aunt Margaret." "Emma." I turned and walked back to my house, feeling their eyes on me the entire way. Once inside, I leaned against the door and let out a long breath. My heart was racing, but I felt oddly exhilarated. I'd stood up to her. I'd made it clear that I wasn't going to be bullied or shamed into leaving my own home. This was my house, my life, my choice, and I was just getting started. That evening, I was sitting on my front porch with a cup of tea when Uncle Robert's car pulled into their driveway. I watched as he got out, his face thunderous with anger. Aunt Margaret must have told him about our conversation. Sure enough, within minutes he was storming across the street toward my house. I set down my tea and prepared myself for whatever was coming. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded as he reached my front steps. "Enjoying my tea on my own front porch," I replied calmly. "Would you like to sit down?" "Don't play games with me, Jessica. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This house, this whole situation, it's completely inappropriate. What's inappropriate about buying a house? You're stalking us. You're trying to force yourself back into our lives after we made it clear that we needed space." "I'm not stalking anyone," I said, my voice leveled despite the anger boiling in my chest. "I bought a house in a neighborhood I liked. If you're uncomfortable with that, you're free to move somewhere else." We've lived here for 15 years. We have roots here, friends, a community. And now I have a house here too. Funny how that works. Uncle Robert stepped closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think this is some kind of revenge? Revenge for what? For you finally being honest about how you feel about me? For you doing me the favor of making it clear that I was never really welcome in your family? We took you in. We raised you. We gave you everything. You gave me a roof over my head and food on the table, I said, standing up to meet his gaze. You did your duty, but you never gave me a family, and you never gave me love. And now that I've found a way to be happy without you, you can't stand it. You're delusional if you think. I think I'm done with this conversation, I interrupted. You're on my property, you're clearly intoxicated, and you're being hostile. I'd like you to leave. Or what? Or I'll call the police and have you removed. We stared at each other for a long moment. Uncle Robert was clearly struggling with the desire to say more, to escalate the confrontation. But even drunk, he was smart enough to know that threatening me on my own property wasn't going to end well for him. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, I replied. Your opinion of me and my choices stopped mattering the day you asked me to leave your house. Go home, Uncle Robert. Go home and leave me alone. He turned and stalked back across the street, and I watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd never spoken to him like that before, never stood up for myself so directly. It felt good, but it also felt like the final nail in the coffin of our relationship, which was fine. I was building a new life now, and there was no room in it for people who saw me as a burden. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into making my house truly mine. I hired contractors to update the kitchen and bathroom, planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, and started hosting dinner parties for my colleagues from school. My house became a gathering place for the kind of people I wanted in my life: educators, book lovers, people who appreciated good conversation and genuine connection. The contrast with my old life couldn't have been more stark. Instead of begging for scraps of attention from people who saw me as an obligation, I was surrounded by colleagues and friends who valued my opinions, laughed at my jokes, and sought out my company. The dinner parties I hosted were filled with laughter and meaningful conversation. Nothing like the stilted holiday gatherings at Aunt Margaret's house where I'd always felt like an outsider looking in. My neighbor to the right, Mrs. Chen, was a retired librarian who shared my love of books. We started a 2-person book club that met every Saturday morning on one of our porches. My neighbor to the left, Dave, was a fellow teacher who worked at the high school. We often carpooled to district meetings and shared resources for our classrooms. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged in my own neighborhood. I wasn't the weird relative who didn't quite fit in. I was Jessica, the friendly teacher who always had her Christmas lights up first and brought homemade cookies to the neighborhood block parties. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice the changes happening across the street. Aunt Margaret's house, which had always been meticulously maintained, was starting to show signs of neglect. The lawn needed edging, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and several of the shutters had come loose and were hanging at odd angles. Through Emma, who still visited me regularly despite her parents' disapproval, I learned that Uncle Robert had been drinking more heavily since our confrontation. He'd apparently become obsessed with my presence in the neighborhood, driving past my house multiple times a day and making increasingly bitter comments about my stalking behavior. He's driving Mom crazy, Emma confided during one of our afternoon visits. She keeps telling him to just ignore you, but he can't seem to let it go. I'm sorry this is causing problems in your family, I said, though I wasn't entirely sorry. But I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now. I know, and I'm glad you're here. But Jessica, maybe you could try to smooth things over. Maybe invite them to dinner or something. I looked at Emma with affection and sadness. At 16, she still believed that most conflicts could be resolved with good intentions and effort. She didn't understand that some people simply chose to see you as the enemy, no matter what you did. Emma, your parents made their feelings about me very clear. They don't want me in their lives. I'm not going to chase after people who've rejected me. But your family. No, I said gently but firmly. I'm not. They made that very clear on Christmas Eve. And you know what? That's okay. I've built a real family now, with people who choose to have me in their lives. Emma looked confused. What do you mean? I gestured around my living room, where photos from recent dinner parties and school events decorated the mantelpiece. My colleagues, my friends, my neighbors who actually like having me around. Mrs. Chen brings me soup when I'm sick. Dave helps me with home repairs. My friend Lisa from school calls me when she needs advice. These people choose to include me in their lives because they enjoy my company, not out of obligation. That's not the same as family, Emma protested. You're right, I agreed. It's better. It's based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than blood obligation and guilt. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, she said, I choose to have you in my life. I know you do, sweetheart, and that means the world to me. But I'm not going to beg your parents to accept me anymore. I spent 23 years doing that, and it never worked. I'm done. Spring arrived with a flourish of color in my garden. The bulbs I'd planted in the fall bloomed in brilliant waves of yellow, purple, and pink. My vegetable garden was thriving, and I'd added a small herb garden near the kitchen window. The contractors had finished their work, and my house looked like something out of a home and garden magazine. More importantly, it felt like home. Every corner reflected my personality and preferences. The built-in bookshelves were filled with my favorite novels and teaching resources. The kitchen was painted a warm yellow that caught the morning light perfectly. The bathroom had been transformed from a dingy afterthought into a spa-like retreat, with subway tiles and a clawfoot tub I'd found at an antique store. I was hosting a dinner party for 6 of my favorite colleagues when I noticed Aunt Margaret standing at her back fence, staring at my house with an expression I couldn't quite read. My guests were laughing at something Dave had said, and the sound carried clearly across the small space between our properties. Jessica, my friend Maria called from the kitchen. Where did you get this amazing pasta salad recipe? It's my grandmother's, I called back, from my mother's side. It was true. I'd found the recipe in a box of my mother's things that Aunt Margaret had given me years ago. It was one of the few connections I had to my parents, and sharing it with friends who appreciated it felt like honoring their memory in a way I'd never been able to do in Aunt Margaret's house. When I looked back toward the fence, Aunt Margaret was gone, but I caught a glimpse of her silhouette in her kitchen window, watching my dinner party with what looked like longing. For just a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but then Dave made another joke, and my friends burst into laughter, and I remembered that I had everything I needed right here. That weekend, I was working in my front garden when a car I didn't recognize pulled into Aunt Margaret's driveway. A well-dressed woman in her 40s got out, followed by a man with a clipboard and a measuring tape. They spent about an hour walking around the property, taking notes and photos. A few days later, Emma appeared at my back fence looking distressed. Jessica, I need to tell you something. Mom and Dad are thinking about selling the house. I set down my trowel and gave her my full attention. Why? Because of you, she said miserably. Dad can't stand living across from you, and Mom says the neighborhood doesn't feel like home anymore. They've been talking about moving somewhere smaller, maybe closer to Sarah and Michael. I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Part of me was triumphant. They were so bothered by my success and happiness that they were willing to uproot their lives to get away from me. But part of me was also sad for Emma, who would lose the only home she'd ever known. How do you feel about that? I asked. I hate it, she said, tears welling in her eyes. This is my home. All my friends are here, my school, everything. And besides, I don't want to move away from you. You're the only one in this family who's ever really listened to me. Emma, it's not fair, she burst out. They're the ones who kicked you out, and now they're punishing the rest of us because you turned out to be fine without them. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma had summed up the situation more clearly than any adult in her family ever had. Sweetheart, if they decide to move, that's their choice, but you're only 16. In 2 years, you'll be in college, and after that, you can choose where you want to live and who you want to have in your life. No one can take that away from you. But what if they make me cut contact with you? Then you'll wait until you're 18 and you'll call me, and I'll be here. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Promise? I promise. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. This is my home now. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Aunt Margaret's front yard. I have to admit, I felt a surge of satisfaction when I saw it. After years of being made to feel like I was the problem, like I was the one who didn't belong, they were the ones leaving. But my satisfaction was tempered by genuine concern for Emma, who had become increasingly withdrawn and sullen as the reality of the move set in. She still visited me regularly, but our conversations were shorter and more stilted, as if she was already trying to protect herself from the pain of losing another important relationship. Have they found a new house yet? I asked during one of her visits. They're looking at places near Sarah, she said flatly. Mom says it'll be good to be closer to family. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. They were moving to be closer to family. The family that counted, apparently. Are you okay with that? Emma shrugged. Do I have a choice? You always have choices, Emma. They might not be easy choices and you might not be able to act on them right away, but you always have them. She looked at me with the kind of desperate hope that only teenagers can muster. Will you really be here when I turn 18? I'll be here for as long as you want me to be. The house across the street sold faster than anyone expected. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children who seemed delighted to find such a nice house in a good school district. I watched from my front window as the moving trucks arrived to pack up 20 years of Aunt Margaret's life. Emma spent most of that day at my house, unable to watch her childhood disappear into cardboard boxes. We baked cookies and worked on a scrapbook she was making of all her favorite memories of the house. It was heartbreaking to see her so lost and sad, but I was also proud of her resilience. You know, I said as we arranged photos in the scrapbook, home isn't really about a building. It's about the people who love you and the memories you make with them. Is that why you're not sad about them leaving? She asked. I'm sad that it came to this, I said honestly. I'm sad that your parents couldn't find a way to accept me as part of the family. But I'm not sad about them leaving, because this neighborhood, this house, this is my home now, and it will be here waiting for you whenever you need it. The day of the move, I made a point of being visible in my front yard, tending to my flower beds as the moving trucks loaded up Aunt Margaret's belongings. I wanted her to see me there, thriving in the home I'd built for myself, happy and settled and completely unaffected by her departure. She came over to say goodbye just before getting in her car for the last time. Jessica, she said, her voice stiff with the effort of being polite. I wanted to say goodbye. Goodbye, Aunt Margaret. I hope you're happy in your new home. She looked around my front yard, taking in the blooming flowers, the fresh paint on my shutters, the general air of prosperity and contentment that surrounded my property. You've done well for yourself, she said, and there was something almost like grudging respect in her voice. Yes, I have. I hope there are no hard feelings. I considered this for a moment. Were there hard feelings? Yes, absolutely. But they were my hard feelings to carry, and I didn't owe her absolution. I hope you're happy, I said again, which wasn't quite the same thing but was all I was prepared to offer. She nodded and walked back to her car. I watched as the little convoy, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert in their sedan, Sarah and Michael in their respective SUVs, Emma pressed against the window of Sarah's car looking back at me, pulled out of the neighborhood for the last time. I stood in my front yard until their cars disappeared around the corner, and then I went inside my house and made myself a cup of tea. It was over. The chapter of my life that had been defined by trying to earn their love and acceptance was finally, definitively closed, and I felt free. Over the next few months, I settled into my new reality as the undisputed owner of my own life, without the constant undercurrent of tension and rejection that had colored my interactions with Aunt Margaret's family. I found myself becoming more confident, more outgoing, more willing to take risks and try new things. I started a garden club in the neighborhood that met monthly to share tips and swap plants. I volunteered to coordinate the annual block party, which turned out to be the most successful one in years. I even started dating, something I'd never had much luck with before, probably because I'd been carrying around so much baggage from my dysfunctional family relationships. David was a fellow teacher I'd met at a district conference. He was kind, funny, and completely uninterested in my tragic backstory. He liked me for who I was in the present, not in spite of who I'd been in the past. You seem really settled, he observed one evening as we sat on my back porch after dinner. Like you know exactly who you are and what you want. I do, I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in my life, I actually do. Emma and I stayed in touch through texts and emails. She sent me photos of her new school, her new room, updates on her college applications. She seemed to be adjusting better than I'd expected, though I could tell she was still angry with her parents for forcing the move. I got into State University. She texted me in March of her senior year. I'm thinking about majoring in education. Like you. The message made me smile and cry at the same time. Despite everything her parents had done to drive us apart, I'd still managed to be a positive influence in her life. I'm so proud of you, I texted back. You're going to be an amazing teacher. I want to come visit you during spring break, she replied. Can I stay with you for a few days? I didn't hesitate. Of course. You're always welcome here. Emma's visit was everything I'd hoped it would be. At 17, she was poised on the brink of adulthood, smart and thoughtful, and kind in ways that reminded me why I'd always loved her so much. We spent her week-long visit exploring the city, cooking together, and having the kinds of deep conversations I'd always wished I could have with someone in my family. "I want you to know," she said on her last night, "that what my parents did to you was wrong. I'm ashamed of them for it. Emma, they're your parents. You don't need to choose sides." "I'm not choosing sides. I'm choosing right over wrong. And they were wrong." On the day she left, she hugged me tightly at the airport. "2 more months until I graduate," she said. "And then I'm free to make my own choices about who I want in my life." "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming," I told her. "Your parents raised you well, even if they couldn't see their way to treating me fairly." "You raised me well too," she said. "More than you know." That summer, Emma came to stay with me for 2 weeks before starting college. We spent the time shopping for dorm room supplies, visiting the campus, and talking about her hopes and dreams for the future. It felt like the kind of relationship I'd always imagined having with a younger family member, supportive, loving, based on genuine affection, rather than obligation. "I've been thinking," she said one evening as we sat in my garden watching fireflies, "about family and what it really means." "What have you been thinking?" "That you were right. Family isn't about blood. It's about choice. And I choose you. I choose you too, sweetheart." 3 years later, I was grading papers in my home office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's number. "Jessica," her voice was bright with excitement. "I have news. Good news, I hope? The best news. I got the job. The teaching position at Roosevelt Elementary. I'm going to be a 3rd-grade teacher, just like you." Roosevelt Elementary was in my district, only about 20 minutes from my house. Emma would be living in the same city, working in the same profession, building her life close enough to mine that we could actually be part of each other's day-to-day lives. "That's wonderful," I said. "I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You showed me what it meant to love teaching, to really care about kids." "And Jessica, there's something else." "What?" "I've been thinking about changing my name. Legally, I mean. I want to hyphenate it. Emma Henderson Rodriguez." I was quiet for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Emma, you don't need to. I want to. You're as much my family as anyone who shares my DNA. More, actually. And I want the world to know it." 5 years after I'd been kicked out of Aunt Margaret's house on Christmas Eve, I had the family I'd always wanted. Not the one I'd been born into or adopted into, but the one I'd chosen and earned through love and mutual respect. Emma moved to town that fall and rented a small apartment about 10 minutes from my house. We had dinner together twice a week and spent most weekends working in my garden or exploring the city together. She was exactly the kind of family member I'd always dreamed of having. Someone who chose to include me in her life because she genuinely enjoyed my company. At her first Christmas as a working teacher, she came to my house for Christmas Eve dinner. I'd invited David, Mrs. Chen, Dave from next door, and a few other close friends. It was nothing like the elaborate, tense gatherings I remembered from Aunt Margaret's house. It was warm and relaxed and full of genuine affection. "This is what Christmas should feel like," Emma said, as we sat around my table, sharing stories and laughing at David's terrible jokes. "This is what family should feel like," I corrected. After everyone else had gone home, Emma and I sat by my fireplace, drinking hot chocolate and watching the flames dance. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought this house?" she asked. "If you'd just moved away after that Christmas?" I considered the question. "Sometimes. But I think this was always meant to happen. I was always meant to find my way to this life, with these people, in this place that's truly home. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you fought for your right to be here. I'm glad I fought too. But Emma, I didn't fight for them. I fought for me. I fought for the right to build the life I wanted, regardless of what anyone else thought about it." That night, after Emma had gone home to her own apartment, I sat alone in my living room looking around at the life I'd built. The photos on the mantelpiece showed dinner parties with friends, school events with my students, vacations with David, holidays with Emma and my chosen family. The bookshelves held novels I'd read for pleasure, not just to impress anyone. The furniture was exactly what I liked, arranged exactly how I wanted it. This house had been my act of defiance, my refusal to accept the role of grateful outsider that Aunt Margaret's family had assigned to me. But it had become so much more than that. It had become the foundation for a life built on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than tolerating me out of obligation. 7 years after that terrible Christmas Eve, I got a wedding invitation in the mail. Sarah's oldest daughter was getting married, and despite everything that had happened, I'd been invited to the wedding. I stared at the elegant cardstock for a long time, unsure how to feel. Part of me was curious about how they were all doing, whether Uncle Robert had gotten his drinking under control, whether Aunt Margaret had found happiness in her new life. But mostly, I realized I didn't really care anymore. That chapter of my life was closed. The people who mattered to me now were Emma, David, my friends and colleagues, my neighbors who actually liked having me around. I didn't need closure or reconciliation with people who had shown me, repeatedly and clearly, that they didn't want me in their lives. I threw the invitation away and planned a weekend trip to the mountains with David instead. 2 months later, Emma called me in tears. "She's dying," she said. "Mom, she has cancer and it's bad." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the phone pressed to my ear. "I'm so sorry, Emma. How are you holding up?" "I don't know. She wants to see you." The words hung in the air between us. After 7 years of silence, after all the hurt and rejection and bitter words, Aunt Margaret wanted to see me. "Do you want me to come?" I asked. Yes, I think I do, but only if you want to. I don't want you to feel like you have to." I thought about it for a long moment. Did I want to see Aunt Margaret one last time? Did I want to hear whatever apology or final words she might have for me? "I'll come," I said finally. "Not for her, but for you. If you need me there, I'll be there." The hospital room was small and sterile, filled with the kind of medicinal smell that clings to everything. Aunt Margaret looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by illness and age. Uncle Robert sat in the corner chair, looking older and more fragile than his 65 years. "Jessica," Aunt Margaret said when she saw me, her voice barely a whisper. "You came. Emma asked me to." She nodded, as if she understood the distinction. I needed to tell you something." I waited, not sure what I was hoping to hear. "I was wrong," she said finally. "About you, about the way we treated you. You deserved better." The apology I'd wanted for so many years was finally being offered, but it felt hollow somehow. Too late, and not enough. "Yes, I did deserve better," I said simply. "I was jealous," she continued, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, "of how easily you connected with people, how much Emma loved you, how you seemed to find happiness even when we made it hard for you." I looked at Uncle Robert, who was staring at his hands. "Is this how you feel too?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and sad. "I regret a lot of things," he said. "The drinking, the anger, the way I spoke to you that night at your house. I regret all of it." "Okay," I said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement." Aunt Margaret reached for my hand with fingers that felt like paper. "Are you happy, Jessica? Are you really happy?" I thought about my life, my house that I loved, my job that fulfilled me, my friends who chose to include me, David who loved me, Emma who had become the family I'd always wanted. "Yes," I said. "I'm really happy." She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. "Good. I'm glad." She died 2 days later. I went to the funeral, sitting in the back with David and Emma, watching as her biological family mourned the woman who had never quite figured out how to love the orphaned girl she'd taken in. At the reception afterward, several people came up to me with versions of the same sentiment. "She talked about you a lot in recent years. She was proud of what you'd accomplished." Proud. After all these years, she'd been proud of me, but she'd never been able to say it when it might have mattered, when it might have changed the trajectory of our relationship. "Are you okay?" David asked as we drove home from the funeral. "I think I am," I said, and realized it was true. I'd gotten the apology I'd once wanted, but I no longer needed it. I'd built a life so full and satisfying that their rejection no longer had the power to wound me. Emma inherited a small sum of money from her grandmother's estate, and she used it as a down payment on a house 3 blocks from mine. We were neighbors now in the best possible way, close enough to see each other regularly, far enough apart to maintain our independence. I keep thinking about what would have happened if she'd just tried to love you, Emma said one evening as we sat on her new front porch. "We can't change the past," I said, "but we can choose how to move forward." "I choose this," she said, gesturing between us. "I choose the family we've built together." Me too. 10 years after I'd bought the house that changed my life, I hosted my annual Christmas Eve dinner. The table was crowded with friends, colleagues, neighbors, and chosen family. David carved the turkey while Mrs. Chen told stories about her grandchildren. Emma helped me serve dessert, while Dave regaled everyone with his latest home renovation disasters. As I looked around my dining room, filled with people who genuinely wanted to be there, who chose to spend their holiday with me because they enjoyed my company, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for that terrible Christmas Eve that had set everything in motion. If Aunt Margaret hadn't kicked me out, I might never have found the courage to build this life. I might have spent decades more accepting scraps of affection from people who saw me as an obligation. I might never have learned what it felt like to be truly valued and loved. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, appearing at my elbow with a cup of coffee. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am," I said. "For what?" "For that Christmas Eve when your mother asked me to leave. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." Emma looked around the room, taking in the scene of genuine warmth and affection that surrounded us. "You know what the crazy part is?" "What?" "You didn't just build a better life for yourself. You built a better family. This is what holidays are supposed to feel like." She was right. I'd taken the pain of rejection and transformed it into something beautiful. I'd taken the loneliness of being an outsider and used it to create a space where everyone belonged. As my guests prepared to leave that night, each one hugged me goodbye and thanked me for including them in my celebration. "Same time next year?" Mrs. Chen asked, as she did every Christmas. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, as I always did. After everyone had gone home and Emma had helped me clean up the dishes, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. The house was quiet, but not empty. It hummed with the warmth of friendship and chosen family. I thought about the scared, desperate woman I'd been 10 years ago, sitting in her car outside Aunt Margaret's house, wondering if she'd ever find a place where she belonged. I wished I could go back and tell her that the pain she was feeling was just the beginning of something beautiful. That sometimes, the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that you don't need the people who don't want you. I'd bought this house as an act of defiance, but it had become so much more. It had become the foundation for a life built on my own terms, surrounded by people who chose to love me. It had become proof that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up for each other, again and again, because you want to. And in the end, that made all the difference. Outside my window, snow began to fall, covering my neighborhood in a blanket of pristine white. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and I would spend it exactly as I chose, quietly, contentedly, surrounded by the life I'd built from the ashes of rejection. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to that bitter Christmas Eve that had started it all. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. And sometimes, buying the house next door to the people who rejected you isn't about revenge at all. Sometimes, it's about coming home.